Marcus Rodriguez had seen combat in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. As a Navy SEAL with 12 years of active service, he thought he knew everything about war zones and the people who inhabited them. His muscular frame bore scars from shrapnel, his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of a warrior, and his confidence bordered on arrogance when it came to assessing threats and capabilities. That confidence would be shattered in a small field hospital in Somalia, where he lay recovering from a bullet wound to his left shoulder. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but it had effectively ended his current mission and landed him in this makeshift medical facility run by Doctors Without Borders. The hospital was nothing more than converted shipping containers and canvas tents, situated dangerously close to rebel-controlled territory. Sarah Chen didn't look like much to Marcus. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing maybe 120 pounds soaking wet, the 32-year-old nurse appeared fragile and out of place in this harsh environment. Her black hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her scrubs hung loosely on her small frame. She spoke softly, moved quietly through the wards, and seemed to jump at sudden noises. To Marcus, she embodied everything weak about civilians who thought they could make a difference in war zones. "You shouldn't be here," Marcus told her bluntly on his second day, as she checked his bandages with gentle hands. "This isn't a place for someone like you." Sarah's dark eyes met his briefly before she looked away. "Someone has to help the wounded," she replied in her quiet voice, her slight accent revealing her Chinese-American heritage. Marcus snorted. "When the shooting starts, you'll be the first one running. I've seen it before. Civilians think they're brave until bullets start flying." Sarah didn't respond, simply finished her work and moved on to the next patient. But Marcus noticed something in her eyes, a flash of something that didn't match her meek exterior. He dismissed it as hurt feelings and forgot about it. The field hospital treated a mix of patients: coalition forces, local civilians, and sometimes even captured enemy combatants. Sarah treated them all with the same quiet dedication, never showing favoritism or fear. She worked 18-hour shifts, barely ate, and slept in a small tent behind the main medical facility. Other staff members clearly respected her, but Marcus couldn't understand why. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the lead surgeon and Sarah's closest friend at the facility, tried to explain it to Marcus one evening. "You're judging her by her size," the older woman said as they sat in the makeshift cafeteria. "Sarah has been in more combat zones than most soldiers. She's seen things that would break stronger people." "She's a nurse," Marcus replied dismissively. "Not a fighter." Elena laughed, a sound without humor. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Sarah was in Aleppo when the hospital she worked at was bombed 3 times in 1 week. She was in South Sudan during the worst of the fighting. She's been in places where medical personnel were specifically targeted." Marcus wasn't convinced. "Being in dangerous places doesn't make you dangerous." "No," Elena agreed. "But surviving them does something to you. Changes you." That conversation took place on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Marcus would understand exactly what Elena meant. The attack came at dawn, just as the morning shift was beginning their rounds. Marcus was awake, staring at the ceiling of his tent and planning his return to active duty, when the first mortar round exploded 50 meters from the hospital perimeter. The sound sent him rolling out of his cot, his combat instincts taking over despite his injured shoulder. Outside, chaos erupted. Rebel forces had surrounded the hospital compound during the night, and now they were launching a coordinated assault. The security detail, 4 local guards and 2 coalition soldiers, were already engaged in a fierce firefight at the main gate. Automatic weapon fire echoed across the compound, punctuated by the whistle and crash of incoming mortars. Marcus grabbed his sidearm from his personal effects and moved toward the sound of gunfire, his SEAL training overriding the pain in his shoulder. But as he emerged from his tent, he saw something that stopped him cold. Sarah Chen was calmly walking between the medical tents, seemingly oblivious to the bullets whizzing overhead. She wasn't running or hiding. She was organizing. "All patients who can move. To the reinforced bunker now," she called out in a voice that carried authority Marcus had never heard from her before. "Walking wounded. Help carry the stretcher cases. Move quickly. But don't panic. A mortar round exploded 20 meters away, showering the area with dirt and debris. Sarah didn't even flinch. She continued coordinating the evacuation with the precision of a military officer, directing patients and staff with quick, decisive commands. Marcus watched in amazement as the quiet, meek nurse transformed into someone completely different. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, her voice steady and calm. She seemed to anticipate where the next threat would come from, positioning herself to shield patients from incoming fire. "Sarah," Dr. Vasquez called out from the surgery tent. "We have 3 patients who can't be moved." "Sarah." "I'll stay with them," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Get everyone else to safety." That's when Marcus realized she wasn't planning to evacuate. She was planning to stay and fight. The rebel forces had clearly done their reconnaissance. They knew the hospital's layout, its weak points, and its limited defenses. What they hadn't counted on was encountering someone like Sarah Chen. As the security forces at the perimeter began to fall back, overwhelmed by superior numbers, Sarah disappeared into the main medical tent. Marcus followed, his curiosity overcoming his caution. Inside, he found her kneeling beside a lockbox he'd never noticed before. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she entered a combination and opened the metal container. Inside was equipment that definitely didn't belong to Doctors Without Borders. Military-grade communications gear, tactical medical supplies, and what appeared to be components for improvised explosive devices. Sarah's fingers worked quickly, assembling something that looked disturbingly familiar to Marcus's trained eye. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded. Sarah looked up, and for the first time, Marcus saw her eyes clearly. There was no fear there. No uncertainty. There was only cold, calculating intelligence, and something that looked very much like controlled fury. "My job," she said simply. The first wave of attackers breached the perimeter as Sarah finished her preparations. Through the tent opening, Marcus could see armed men in mismatched uniforms advancing through the compound. They moved with confidence, believing they were overwhelming a helpless medical facility. They were about to learn otherwise. Sarah stood, her transformation complete. The nervous, quiet nurse was gone. In her place stood someone who moved with the fluid grace of a trained operative. She checked a small tactical radio, then looked at Marcus. "You can help me, or you can get to the bunker with the others," she said. "But if you stay, follow my lead, and don't ask questions." Marcus stared at her, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. "Who are you?" Sarah's expression softened slightly. And for a moment, the gentle nurse he'd known appeared again. "Someone who really doesn't like it when people threaten her patients." The sound of approaching footsteps ended their conversation. The attackers were close now, and there was no more time for explanations. Sarah moved to the tent's rear exit, gesturing for Marcus to follow. As they slipped out into the chaos of the compound, Marcus realized that everything he thought he knew about Sarah Chen had been completely wrong. The quiet, frightened nurse had been a facade. The real Sarah was about to reveal herself, and Marcus had the distinct feeling that the rebel forces had just made a very serious mistake. The attack was intensifying, with more explosions echoing across the compound. In the distance, Marcus could hear the distinct sound of heavy weapons being brought to bear. The rebels weren't just raiding the hospital, they were trying to destroy it completely. But as Sarah led him through the smoke and chaos, moving with the confidence of someone who had done this before, Marcus began to suspect that the attackers had seriously underestimated their target. Whatever Sarah's real background was, she clearly had training and resources that went far beyond medical care. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the compound as the battle for the hospital began in earnest. And somewhere in those shadows, a small nurse was preparing to teach 45 armed men a lesson they would never forget. Sarah moved through the compound with purpose, leading Marcus away from the main medical facility toward what appeared to be a maintenance shed. Her transformation continued to astound him. Every movement was calculated, every step deliberate. She wasn't running from the fight, she was positioning herself for it. "Stay low and follow my exact path," she instructed, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in combat situations. The ground here is mined with pressure-sensitive devices I placed yesterday. Marcus nearly stumbled. You mined the hospital compound? I mined the approaches to critical infrastructure, Sarah corrected, never breaking stride. There's a difference. It's a difference. As if to prove her point, an explosion erupted behind them where 3 rebels had been advancing toward the generator building. The blast sent 2 of them flying, while the third stumbled backward, screaming. Sarah didn't even look back. How did you know they would come? Marcus demanded, struggling to keep up despite his training. Because they've been watching us for 3 weeks, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. Same pattern every time. They scout medical facilities, identify the most vulnerable targets, then hit just after dawn when people are tired and off guard. They reached the maintenance shed, and Sarah quickly opened what Marcus had assumed was a simple storage building. Inside, he discovered an arsenal that would have impressed any special forces unit. Weapons, ammunition, surveillance equipment, and enough explosives to level half the compound were neatly organized and ready for use. Doctors Without Borders doesn't exactly stock this kind of medical equipment, Marcus observed. Sarah was already moving, checking weapons with practiced efficiency. Doctors Without Borders doesn't. But someone has to protect them when they're trying to save lives in places like this. And she handed Marcus a tactical rifle, noting his injured shoulder. Can you shoot left-handed? I can shoot with my teeth if I have to, Marcus replied, his respect for this woman growing by the minute. Good, because we're about to get very busy. Through the small window, Marcus could see rebel forces spreading throughout the compound. They moved in coordinated teams, suggesting better training and leadership than typical militia groups. These weren't desperate locals fighting for scraps. This was an organized military operation. Sarah activated a tablet that displayed a detailed map of the compound, complete with real-time positions of both friendly and hostile forces. Small red dots moved across the screen, showing the exact locations of the attacking forces. Surveillance network I installed on my second day here, she explained, seeing Marcus's expression. Motion sensors, cameras, and a few other toys that help keep track of who's where. The red dots were converging on the main medical facility where the patients and staff were sheltering. Sarah's expression hardened as she watched their movement patterns. They're not just here to raid supplies, she said grimly. Look at their formation. They're planning to eliminate everyone in the facility. Marcus studied the screen and felt his blood run cold. She was right. This wasn't a robbery or even a typical terrorist attack. Someone wanted to send a message by completely destroying the hospital and everyone in it. We need to call for backup, Marcus said, reaching for his radio. Already did. Coalition forces are 45 minutes out. We don't have 45 minutes. Sarah shouldered a rifle that looked military spec but had modifications Marcus didn't recognize. Those patients can't be moved, and the bunker won't hold against the explosives these people brought. How many attackers are we talking about? Sarah consulted her tablet again. 45 confirmed. Possibly more in reserve outside my sensor range. All armed with automatic weapons, RPGs, and enough explosives to level this entire facility. Marcus stared at her. Even with his SEAL training and her mysterious background, those were impossible odds. We can't take on 45 armed men. That's suicide. Sarah looked at him with something that might have been disappointment. I'm not planning to take them on, Marcus. I'm planning to stop them. There's a difference. Before he could ask what that difference was, Sarah was moving again. She gathered several devices from the arsenal, things that looked like tactical radios but had additional components Marcus didn't recognize. She also grabbed what appeared to be a modified medical bag. Your job is to protect the medical facility, she told him as they prepared to leave the shed. Stay mobile. Keep them from getting close to the bunker. And trust that I know what I'm doing. What's your job? Sarah's smile was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen from her. It was calm, confident, and absolutely terrifying. My job is to make them regret ever coming here. They split up as soon as they left the shed. Marcus headed toward the medical facility, using every piece of cover available as bullets whined overhead. Behind him, Sarah disappeared into the maze of supply tents, and equipment containers that surrounded the main compound. The first indication that Sarah was implementing her plan came when the compound's power grid began fluctuating. Lights flickered throughout the facility, and Marcus could hear confused shouting from the attacking forces. Their night vision equipment and electronic communications were being disrupted by some kind of electromagnetic interference. Then the explosions started. Not random explosions, carefully planned detonations that took out specific targets. The rebels' heavy weapons position was the first to go, eliminated by what sounded like a precision charge that left the surrounding area untouched. Next was their communications hub, identified by the distinctive whine of radio equipment being destroyed. Marcus reached the medical facility's defensive position just as the first wave of attackers arrived. The remaining security forces were badly outnumbered and falling back rapidly. Marcus took up position behind a concrete barrier and began picking off targets, his SEAL training proving invaluable despite his injured shoulder. But even as he fought, he found himself distracted by what was happening elsewhere in the compound. Sarah was systematically dismantling the attacking force with a precision that defied belief. Explosions continued to rock specific positions, always targeting equipment and personnel clusters with surgical accuracy. Through his radio, Marcus could hear the confusion and growing panic among the rebel forces. Their coordinated attack was falling apart as their equipment failed, and their positions were compromised one by one. Someone was outmaneuvering them completely, turning their own tactics against them. A group of 6 rebels tried to flank the medical facility by coming around the eastern perimeter. Marcus was preparing to engage them when they suddenly stopped advancing. Through his scope, he watched as they looked around in confusion, then began backing away from something he couldn't see. Moments later, that section of the compound erupted in flames. "What the hell is she doing out there?" Dr. Vasquez asked over the radio from inside the bunker. "Winning," Marcus replied, though he wasn't entirely sure how. The attack had been going on for 20 minutes when the rebels began to retreat. Not a tactical withdrawal, a full-scale panic retreat. Marcus could see them abandoning equipment and wounded comrades as they fled toward the compound's perimeter. Something had broken their morale completely. That's when he saw Sarah. She emerged from behind a supply container, moving calmly across an open area that should have been under heavy fire. But the firing had stopped. In fact, Marcus realized he hadn't heard any gunfire from the rebel positions in several minutes. Sarah was carrying her modified medical bag and had what appeared to be a small electronic device in her other hand. As Marcus watched, she approached a wounded rebel who had been left behind by his retreating comrades. Instead of treating him as an enemy, she knelt beside him and began providing medical care. The wounded man tried to raise his weapon, but Sarah calmly took it away and continued working on his injuries. She spoke to him in what sounded like Arabic, her voice gentle and reassuring. The man stopped struggling and allowed her to treat his wounds. Marcus couldn't understand what he was witnessing. Moments ago, this woman had been systematically destroying an attacking force of 45 armed men. Now she was providing medical aid to one of them with the same quiet compassion he'd seen her show to every patient. Over the next hour, as coalition reinforcements arrived and secured the area, the full scope of what Sarah had accomplished became clear. She had eliminated or neutralized the entire attacking force without killing a single person. The explosions had targeted equipment and positions, not people. The electromagnetic interference had disabled their communications and night vision but hadn't harmed anyone. Even the flames that had driven away the flanking group turned out to be non-lethal flash devices designed to create fear rather than casualties. "How?" Marcus asked when he finally found Sarah in the main medical tent, back to treating patients, as if nothing unusual had happened. "How what?" she replied, not looking up from the IV line she was inserting into a young Somali girl's arm. "How did you stop 45 armed men without killing them?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then looked up at Marcus with those calm, intelligent eyes. "Because killing them wouldn't have solved the problem. They're not evil, Marcus. They're desperate, hungry, and scared. They attack places like this because someone is paying them to, or because they think it's their only option. So you just..." "What? Convince them to leave?" "I removed their ability to continue the attack and showed them a way out that didn't involve dying or going to prison. Most people, even angry people, will choose survival over destruction if you give them a reasonable alternative. Marcus stared at her, trying to process what she'd told him. That's not possible. You can't just talk down an armed assault force. I didn't talk them down, Sarah said patiently. I outmaneuvered them, neutralized their equipment, and then offered them a choice: fight to the death for a cause that was already lost, or withdraw and live to see their families again. But the explosions, the weapons, the surveillance equipment, tools, Sarah said simply, very specialized tools for a very specific job. The more Marcus learned about what had happened, the more questions he had. Sarah had somehow anticipated the attack, prepared countermeasures, and executed a defense plan that protected everyone in the facility while neutralizing a vastly superior force. It was the kind of operation that would have challenged an entire special forces unit, and she had done it alone. As evening fell and the compound returned to its normal routine, Marcus found himself studying Sarah with new eyes. The gentle nurse was back, moving quietly through the wards and caring for patients with the same soft-spoken dedication he'd observed before. But now he knew it was only one facet of a much more complex person. You're not just a nurse, are you? He asked when they were alone in the supply room. Sarah continued counting medical supplies, her expression thoughtful. I am a nurse, she said finally. Everything else is just additional training that helps me do my job better in places like this. Additional training from who? Sarah turned to face him, and Marcus saw a flicker of something in her eyes: sadness, perhaps, or old pain. People who understand that sometimes the best way to save lives is to be very, very good at not taking them. That night, as Marcus lay in his cot thinking about everything he'd witnessed, he realized that his assumptions about strength and weakness, about courage and fear, had been completely shattered by a 5'4" nurse who looked like she couldn't hurt a fly. But there were still questions. Sarah's equipment, her training, her advanced knowledge of the attack, none of it made sense for a simple medical volunteer. There was clearly more to her story. And Marcus found himself determined to understand exactly who Sarah Chen really was. The attack had been repelled, the hospital was safe, and the patients were recovering. But for Marcus, the real revelation was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries about the woman who had single-handedly defeated an army while never once compromising her oath to do no harm. Marcus couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw images of Sarah moving through the compound with impossible calm, systematically dismantling a superior force while protecting everyone around her. The questions burned in his mind like a fever. Who was she? What organization had trained her? And why was she working in a field hospital in Somalia instead of leading some elite unit somewhere? The answers came the next morning in the most unexpected way. Marcus was helping Dr. Vasquez inventory medical supplies when a helicopter appeared on the horizon. It wasn't the standard coalition aircraft they were expecting. This was a sleek, unmarked transport that landed with military precision outside the compound perimeter. 3 people emerged from the aircraft: 2 men in civilian clothes, who moved like operators, and a woman in her 50s, wearing the insignia of a colonel in an organization Marcus didn't recognize. They requested a meeting with Sarah immediately. I was wondering when you'd show up, Sarah said when the visitors were escorted into the main tent. Her voice carried a weariness that Marcus had never heard before. The colonel, a stern-faced woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes, studied Sarah carefully. The attack was observed by satellite. We need a full debrief. The attack was repelled with 0 friendly casualties and minimal enemy losses, Sarah replied in a tone that suggested she'd given similar reports before. Mission parameters were maintained. Your mission parameters were to provide medical aid and gather intelligence, the colonel said sharply. Not to engage in active countermeasures against a reinforced platoon. Sarah's expression didn't change. My primary mission parameter has always been to protect civilian lives. Everything else is secondary. Marcus found himself forgotten in the corner of the tent as the conversation continued. Gradually, pieces of Sarah's real identity began to emerge. She wasn't just a nurse, she was something called a medical operations specialist for an organization that seemed to operate in the shadows between military and civilian agencies. Her job was to embed with humanitarian organizations in unstable regions, providing both medical care and intelligence gathering, while serving as a last line of defense for civilian populations. It was work that required extensive medical training, advanced combat skills, and the psychological ability to switch between healer and protector at a moment's notice. "How long have you been doing this?" Marcus asked Sarah later, after the visitors had left with their debrief. 8 years, Sarah replied, her voice quiet again now that the official business was finished. "Started right after I finished my nursing degree in specialized trauma training. 8 years of this? How many times have you had to do what you did yesterday?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the compound where children were now playing soccer between the medical tents. "More than I'd like, less than I feared when I started." The full scope of Sarah's background slowly became clear over the following days. She had medical degrees from Johns Hopkins and specialized training in emergency surgery, trauma care, and psychological counseling, but she also had other qualifications that painted a very different picture. Advanced certifications in explosive ordnance disposal, electronic warfare, psychological operations, and something called non-lethal engagement protocols. She spoke 6 languages fluently, had served in medical capacities in every major conflict zone of the past decade, and had been decorated by 3 different governments for her humanitarian work. Yet she'd never carried a rank, never worn a uniform, and never officially existed in any military database. "We call them angels, Doctor," Vasquez explained to Marcus one evening. "People like Sarah who show up in the worst places and somehow make them a little bit safer. They're not soldiers, but they're not exactly civilians either. They exist in the spaces between, where someone needs to make sure the people trying to help don't get killed for their efforts." Marcus began to understand the weight that Sarah carried. She lived constantly in 2 worlds, the world of healing and the world of conflict. She had to be prepared to save lives and to protect them, often simultaneously. It required a kind of mental flexibility that Marcus couldn't fully comprehend. "Doesn't it mess with your head?" he asked Sarah one afternoon as they worked together treating patients in the children's ward. Switching back and forth between helping and fighting, Sarah considered the question carefully while checking the bandages on a young boy who'd been injured by an unexploded mine. "I don't think of it as switching," she said finally. "It's all the same job, really, protecting life. Sometimes that means administering antibiotics. Sometimes it means neutralizing people who want to harm innocent civilians. The tools are different, but the purpose is the same. But you could have killed those attackers easily. I saw your equipment, your positioning. You had them completely outgunned and outmaneuvered. Why didn't you?" Sarah's hands never paused in their gentle care of the child. But Marcus saw something flicker across her expression. "Because once you start taking lives, even justified ones, it changes you. I've seen what happens to people who cross that line too often. They start seeing enemies everywhere, start solving problems with violence first, and compassion second. I can't do my real job if I become that person." It was a philosophy that Marcus struggled to understand. In his world, enemies were eliminated efficiently and permanently. The idea of neutralizing a threat without eliminating it seemed unnecessarily complicated and risky. But as he watched Sarah work over the following days, he began to see the wisdom in her approach. The rebels who had attacked the hospital began sending their wounded to the facility for treatment. Word had spread that the small nurse who had defeated them had also ensured that their injured comrades received medical care. Rather than creating more enemies, her actions had begun to build bridges. Local leaders who had previously been suspicious of the hospital started visiting, bringing their own injured and sick. They spoke of Sarah with a mixture of awe and respect that Marcus had never seen directed toward any military figure. She had become something more powerful than a soldier. She had become a symbol of protection and healing in a region where both were desperately needed. "This is why we do it this way," Sarah explained as they watched a former rebel fighter helping to unload medical supplies from a convoy. The man had lost his leg in an explosive accident the week before and was now volunteering at the hospital while he recovered. "Kill him, and his friends want revenge. Save him, and maybe his friends decide we're not the enemy after all." Marcus's time at the hospital was coming to an end. His shoulder had healed enough for him to return to active duty, and his unit was requesting his immediate return. But leaving felt wrong somehow. He had learned more about courage, strength, and true heroism in 2 weeks with Sarah Chen than in 12 years of military service. "I misjudged you," he told her on his last evening at the facility. They were sitting outside the main tent, watching the sunset paint the African sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "I thought you were weak because you were quiet. I thought you were frightened because you were careful. I was completely wrong." Sarah smiled, the gentle expression he'd first seen her wear. "You weren't wrong about everything. I am frightened. Most of the time. And I am careful. Being scared and being brave aren't opposite things, Marcus. Sometimes being scared is what makes you brave." "What scares you the most?" "Failing," Sarah said without hesitation. "Having someone die because I wasn't good enough, fast enough, or smart enough to protect them. Every patient who comes through those doors is trusting me with their life. That's terrifying and wonderful at the same time." As Marcus prepared to leave the next morning, Sarah gave him something unexpected, a small card with contact information. "If you ever decide that there might be other ways to serve," she said, "call that number. We're always looking for people who understand that real strength isn't about how much damage you can do, but how much damage you can prevent." Marcus looked at the card, then at Sarah. "Are you trying to recruit me? I'm telling you that there are options you might not have considered. Ways to use your training and experience to build things, instead of just breaking them." The helicopter that came to collect Marcus was the same coalition aircraft that had brought him to the hospital weeks earlier. As it lifted off, he looked down at the facility that had become so much more than a medical station. It was a beacon of hope in a region where hope was rare. Protected by a woman who had redefined everything he thought he knew about warfare and healing. 6 months later, Marcus found himself in a training facility in Virginia, learning about non-lethal engagement protocols and advanced medical techniques. The transition from Navy SEAL to medical operations specialist was challenging, requiring him to unlearn some deeply ingrained habits and develop entirely new ways of thinking about conflict and resolution. But every time he struggled with the complexity of his new role, he remembered a small nurse who had defeated 45 armed men without firing a single lethal shot, then spent the rest of the day treating patients with the same gentle hands that had dismantled a military assault. Sarah Chen had shown him that true strength wasn't about overpowering your enemies, it was about finding ways to turn enemies into allies. To protect the innocent while preserving the humanity of everyone involved. It was harder than anything he'd ever done as a SEAL, but it was also more rewarding than any mission he'd ever completed. Years later, when people asked Marcus about the most impressive combat operation he'd ever witnessed, he would tell them about a field hospital in Somalia, where a nurse who looked like she couldn't hurt a fly had single-handedly protected an entire medical facility while never once compromising her oath to do no harm. He would tell them about the day he learned that real heroism wasn't about being fearless, it was about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. It wasn't about being strong, it was about making others stronger. And it wasn't about winning battles, it was about preventing wars. Most of all, he would tell them about Sarah Chen, the woman who had taught him that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the world is a healer's hands, guided by a protector's heart. The field hospital in Somalia continued to operate under Sarah's protection for 3 more years, becoming a model for medical facilities in conflict zones around the world. Her methods were studied, her techniques were taught, and her philosophy spread to a new generation of medical professionals who understood that healing and protecting were 2 sides of the same sacred calling. And in quiet moments, when the work was done and the patients were resting, Sarah would sometimes think about a cocky Navy SEAL who had learned to see strength in gentleness and courage in compassion. She hoped that wherever his new path had taken him, he was making the world a little bit safer for people who needed healing in dangerous places. Because that, after all, was what real heroes did. They made the world better, one life at a time.